So thanks. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have the opportunity to talk about charter schools. I am a researcher at heart, so I'm going to start off by talking about some of my research on charter schools in North Carolina. And you should be aware as I talk about that research is based on data from about 1996 to 2002. So it's not right up to date, but then I will talk more about the current situation, then I'm going to step back and give you my general thoughts about charters and where we go from here. As you'll see from my research, the results are pretty negative, but that doesn't mean I'm negative on charters across the board. I would like to just mention my husband, who's over here, Ted Fisk. He is on the board of a charter school in Durham, the Central Park School. I think we have the principal of that school, where he is here as well. Thanks, there you are. And together, Ted and I have looked at choice in a number of other countries. So a country that I'll refer to at one point is New Zealand, which introduced full parental choice of schools and competitions back in the early 1990s, and we went to New Zealand in 1998. One way to interpret the New Zealand situation is it's like having a whole country of charter schools. Now, they were schools that were converted from traditional public schools, but that allowed us to think about what happens when you have lots and lots of charter schools. So I'll come back to that issue. So let me talk about my early research. This research was with a fellow named Bob Bifulco, who was at Duke at the time, but now is at Syracuse University, and it is based on data through 2002. So we came to three main conclusions. So I'm just going to work through these conclusions. First one, and this is all just data on North Carolina. It's important when doing studies of charter schools to be state-specific, because the charter school laws, as you know, differ one state from another. So we were looking at North Carolina, and we had lots of good data. We had data on individual students, and we could see them moving from traditional public schools into a charter school. We could follow them over time. We had test score data and all sorts of things. First conclusion is charter schools increase racial segregation. And in the period we were looking at, that was very clear. And one of the ways, we could document what was happening because we could see kids moving from traditional public schools. So we'd see them in traditional public schools in 3rd or 4th grade and see them move into charter schools. We were not able to look at kids entering charter schools at kindergarten because we just can't follow those in our data. So we were looking at grades 4 through 8 for this study. But what we found was that as black families put their children into charter schools, they were choosing charter schools that were blacker than the traditional public schools that their children had been in. And then for whites, it went in the same direction for whites. Whites were choosing charter schools that were whiter than the schools that they'd been in. So I've given you, I've called them black switchers. These are families that are switching their child from a traditional public school to a charter school. So they were switching from 53% black to charter schools that on average were 70% black, and the white switchers were in schools that were 70% white, and they moved to even whiter charter schools. So there was no doubt in our mind that certainly during that period that charter schools were increasing racial segregation. The second point is that charter schools, during the period we were looking at, in the grades we were looking at, reduced student achievement on average. Now that isn't to say that there weren't some charter schools that were raising student achievement. Now what do I mean by raising or lowering student achievement? Because we had such rich data on all individual students and we could look at them over time, we could look at the gains that students made while they were in charter schools compared to the gains those students made while they were in traditional public schools, either earlier, before they were in the charter school, or afterwards, after they left the charter school and went back into 7th grade or 8th grade into the traditional public schools. And we found that average achievement went down, and it went down for all groups. It went down on average for whites and for blacks, and even more for blacks than for whites. I've put up some figures here that refer to effects on math test scores. We've normalized everything, so everything's in standard deviation units rather than scale scores. But the only reason for me to put the numbers here is to show you that there are declines for white students on average in the charter schools during the period we were looking at, and then greater declines for blacks, and especially for blacks who made racially segregating moves. So by racially segregating moves here, we're talking about black students who moved from a traditional public school to a charter school that was more than 60% black and more than 10 percentage points higher black percentage than the school from which they came. So I just highlighted at the bottom that this is based on careful modeling. We published all of this. It met all the peer-reviewed standards. There's a national study that looks at achievement of students in charter schools. This is the CREDO study that came out of Stanford that a number of you are probably familiar with, that looks at a number of different states, and they basically confirm our results for North Carolina. So in some other states, sometimes the results are a bit more positive, but overall, nationally, that Stanford study suggests that only 17% of the charter schools outperform the traditional public schools that the children otherwise would have gone to, and that North Carolina was one of the states that was clearly having not very positive, in other words, negative effects. So the third conclusion that follows from these first two and from additional analysis is that charter schools in this state were increasing the black-white test score gap. Now, part of that comes just from the fact that during the period we were looking at, blacks were overrepresented in charter schools. So you have the numbers here. In 2002, blacks accounted for 40% of the charter school population, but only 31% of the traditional public school population. So if students are the ones who are disproportionately moving to the charter school sector, and the charter school sector on average is lowering achievement, that means you're going to increase the black-white test score gap. And then you add to that the fact, our finding that black students were doing even less well in charter schools relative to how they would have done in the traditional public school. That effect gets exacerbated. So those were our three main conclusions. And let me now try to update us a little bit. I haven't done a new study, and I can't do a new careful achievement study now because of the study design we used. It only worked when we had a lot of people switching in grades 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 into the charter schools, and now we've got more of them. I can't go back and do that. But what I did go back is just to try to give an overall picture. So what we've got here is the racial breakdown of charter schools, and I separated K through 8 and then all charter schools. So if you look at those top numbers, so for elementary and middle schools, we've got 52% of the students in the charter schools are white, 36% are black, 7% Hispanic, and slightly different figures when you include in the high schools. So if you just looked at those numbers, you'd say, oh, good, this whole sector, this charter school sector is a diverse sector, and so we don't need to worry about racial segregation. But that's not the right way to look at it, because that's the sector as a whole. The key point here is individual schools, individual charter schools are very segregated. So I looked up the most recent data, and we've got, I don't know whether this is based on 99 schools or 100, but in any case, we've got 37 schools, charter schools, now that have more than 80% white students. And 10 of those 37 actually have more than 90%, and some of them 99%. So we've got a number of schools, more than a third of the schools that are very white now. And then 26 schools now have less than 20% white students, and so the non-white students include Black students or Hispanic students and Indian students. The key point there is we've got different types of schools, some serving white families, some serving black families. I looked up to see how many charter schools had some mix of students. So this is between 40 and 60% white. You could state it the other way around too, between 40 and 60% non-white. The reason, and there are very few schools, there are a few in that category. But the reason I put that up there is in our earlier research, when we found that a lot of black families were moving their children into charter schools that ended up being 90 to 100% black, a number of people turned to us and say, well, that's what families want. And we tried to analyze that earlier in our research to try to figure out if that is what black families want. And we estimated some models called low-chip models that look at probabilities of different things happening. And based on that modeling, we concluded that black families choosing charter schools preferred schools that were 40 to 60% black-white. But the white families, as they made their charter school decisions, preferred schools that were less than 20% black. So what that means when you put those asymmetric preferences together is you're not going to end up with many schools that have 40 to 60% or a balance of black and white, because the minute schools get to be 30%, 40%, 50% black, they tip. And that's the term that a lot of economists use as they talk about residential segregation. But that works for schools as well. So white families then take their kids out of those schools that are increasingly black, and then you end up with very black schools. One other point from our earlier research, we do find a lot of movement of kids into charter schools and then out of schools. And that's important for the policy debate. So one of the explanations we came up with for the low performance in some charter schools was just you've got a lot of movement of students. African Americans in particular might have been looking for a better school for their kids. The traditional public schools weren't working for them. They put their kids in charter schools. That wasn't working. They moved them out. And that means, at least in the period we were looking at earlier, the pre-2002 period, you had a lot of turnover in these schools. We all know, or all the educators in the room know, that having a lot of turnover in schools is not conducive to providing good, coherent education. So I had the data on race. I don't have as much on the income levels of students, but based on 2008, 2009 data that was provided by the Durham Public School District at a recent breakfast that I went to, they provided data on the percent of students statewide who are on free and reduced price lunch. That's what the FRPL is. So in the traditional public schools, about 43% of children are on free and reduced price lunch, and that's a lot lower in the charter schools. And there's other data we could look at as well. For example, the percentage of the students who are special needs students. The charter schools underserve the students who are special needs students relative to the traditional public schools. I provided some data for Durham, which does come from the Durham School District based on 2007-08 data. So there, for the Durham public schools, the traditional public schools, 54% of the students are on free and reduced price lunch, and the 7 charter schools on average in the city have only 32%. There's a star down there pointing that the percent of students in the traditional public schools is rising. So what we've got in a city like Durham, which has a lot of charter schools, is the charter schools serving blacks, and there is a slight, there are disproportionately more blacks in the Durham public schools, in the Durham charter schools than in the traditional public schools, but the charter schools are serving a less needy group of students on average. So what else is going on? In preparation for this talk, I followed up on an issue that has always been a major one for me, which is issues related to accountability. Education has a large public interest. We'll I mean, there is a large public interest in education. I'll come back and say a little more about that. So I talked to people in DPI just to figure out what's going on. Things seem to have gotten better from the time I did the research in 2002. So DPI, the Office of Charter Schools, well, first there's the law that now requires a one-year planning period before a new charter school is started. That makes a lot of sense. It's hard work to set up a new school, and there's a lot of planning that goes into it. So DPI provides assistance during that planning period, and then there's oversight from DPI during the first few years of operation. This makes a lot of sense to me and could improve the operation of charter schools. But I do note here that as of 2008, there were 8 employees in that DPI office doing some of this oversight and providing services, and there are only 3 now related to budget cuts. So if we think these sorts of services are important, which I do, we've got a problem here. So, so where do we go from here? Just one further statement. I told you I can't do any new work and haven't done any new work looking at the achievement effects of charter schools in the recent period. I do know a lot of supporters of charter schools point out that lots of charter schools are doing well, they're meeting performance standards, AYP. You have to be really careful as you look at all of that. If charter schools are serving a more advantaged student body, not all of them are, but if they are on average, you would expect them to do better on some of those measures. So we have to be very careful about drawing any conclusions about the effectiveness of charter schools relative to traditional public schools just by looking at the standard, easy to look at measures of performance on AYP. What you need to do is go back and look at individual students and try to figure out how they would have done otherwise. So where do we go from here in North Carolina? 2 main choices. Expand charters cautiously. I guess there's another choice. Don't expand or get rid of them, but I just don't think that's on the policy agenda at all, so I didn't include that. And keep them on the fringe of the education system, or expand charters significantly and dramatically. So my strong preference is to expand cautiously and to keep them on the fringe of the system. And that reflects a couple of things. The first and most important one for me is just it reflects what I think the education system is all about. It generates public as well as private benefits. That's why we make education compulsory. That's why we're funding public education, because we think that education in this state increases the productivity and the economic health of this state and the political health of the state. And we also think education is important for the life chances of individuals. So there's an equity judgment. So those public benefits of interest are really central to all of the thinking that I do about education policy. But this preference for not expanding broadly also comes from my observations in New Zealand, which I mentioned a little while ago, has the equivalent of a whole country of charter schools, albeit charter schools that converted from traditional public schools. So this is my last slide. So I don't know how long I've been talking, and I'll talk through it. Just briefly.
You're good.
What?
You're good.
Yeah, I'm fine, but I need to know whether to go through this quickly or in 5 minutes or so. And then I hope we can open up for some discussion. So these are some of the reasons that I think it's really important to move very cautiously as we expand charter schools. So the first one is maintain the quality. Now, the quality has been low in many charter schools in the past, but I think we owe it to our kids to make sure that new schools that are opened are quality schools. I mean, there are reasons low-income African Americans are choosing some of these charter schools. They're looking for a quality school. The traditional public school may not be working for them for all sorts of reasons. But if we're going to give them additional options, we need to make sure those options have a strong possibility of being effective in schools. So what do we need for that? Well, we need accountability, we need oversight, and we need support. I mentioned earlier, there's the sense that it's hard work to set up a new school, and there are lots of aspects of that. There's the developing the educational program, the instructional model, but there's also the business model and everything else that goes with that. So I'm all in favor of having employees at DPI there available to give that support. And so that's going to cost some money, and we shouldn't ignore that. There are some costs involved. The leadership, that second point there, turns out to be very important. Ted and I visited lots and lots of schools in New Zealand, and the first schools we visited were the ones that the policymakers who loved this new shift to choice loved to show off to outsiders. Some of these schools just had dynamic leaders, charismatic leaders, and you'd go in and you'd say, boy, isn't this school great? 2 points about this. 2 years later, you'd go back and you'd see that that charismatic leader had burned out and was no longer there. He was just, or she was just exhausted. The other point about it is we cannot plan or should not plan to build an education system that requires leaders be charismatic and fantastic and abnormal. You just can't build a system there. You need to build a system that can operate with more normal people, like the rest of us. And so, because there's a shortage of that energy. It doesn't mean there aren't some terrific leaders and entrepreneurs out there and that we shouldn't take advantage of those, but you just can't build a whole system on that type of leader. And then I've just been reading a report that came out recently from the state of Washington, but it's about national charter schools, and they really emphasize the importance of having strong, well-trained governing boards. So each of these charter schools is run by a governing board, and as a state, if we were to go further with charter schools, we'd need to make sure that those governing boards get the sort of training that would be useful. So all of that costs resources and whatever. So my view is if we're going to do all of those well, we can't have this dramatic expansion of charter schools because there's no way we can do all of that with 50 new charter schools a year, much less 10 new a year, maybe 3 or 4 we could handle. Second point here is just relates to back to one of the initial purposes of charter schools. You know, one of the justifications for charter schools is to promote innovation. So the starting point is we have this big bureaucratic system running, the system's running lots of schools. We need to have some opportunities for people with good ideas to be able to pursue those ideas. And that makes some sense to me. There isn't a lot of evidence nationwide that some of the ideas in charter schools have been translated back into the traditional public school system. There's one reason for that. Some of the best charter schools nationwide, like the KIPP school, do things like have many more instructional hours at school on Saturdays and all sorts of things. So it's not that they're being particularly innovative in terms of programs. What they're doing is spending more and more time on instruction and being focused on test taking, but we can come back to that. But my view is charters have a role to play. I mean, I buy this argument that the system as a whole it's hard to move it, and you wouldn't want to take the whole system and make major changes before you knew whether some of those changes might work. So I like the idea of having this fringe that can try new things and explore new ways of educating children. Now, notice when you're innovating that there are risks involved. So some of these innovations may work and some won't. So if you've got charters just on the fringe of the system and the state decides to charter this particular charter school and then it doesn't quite work out, that's okay, because all of those kids, a relatively small number, can then go back into the traditional public school system. And because education is compulsory, you've got to make sure that they have good schools to go back to. And so that's one point. And then the second here comes directly from our New Zealand experience. New Zealand thought they were going to have all these innovative schools. Each one had its own charter and its own mission, and wasn't this going to be terrific? But the minute they had all of those schools, or within a couple of years, not within a minute, but within a couple of years, they realized that there really is a public interest here in education. And so they started saying, look, each of these charters, which initially were envisioned as school-specific charters, really have to pay attention to this public interest. So the state came in and started regulating them a lot more. And so then you lost some of the capacity to be innovative. So that's why I like keeping charters on the fringe of the system, so that we can maintain this opportunity to use them for one of the initial purposes. I put to facilitate capital planning here. That was an issue that came up in New Zealand, and New Zealand actually did maintain ownership of all the school buildings, even though all the schools then had been converted from public schools, traditional public schools, to charter. And this issue of capital planning came up over and over again. So whenever people said, well, maybe additional funding should be used so it's easier for other charter schools to be set up, there was a cost concern there. If you have space in these schools and not, why spend a lot of money on capital to build new schools? So some of it is just, the building of new schools and the cost of that. Some of it is just planning. If you don't know how many students are going to be in the traditional public school next year or 5 years from now, how do you plan in a cost-effective way in terms of building your facility? And then I've got this next to last point, avoiding the emergence of charter school bureaucracies. And what's happening in many other states is there are these large charter management organizations, or if it's for-profit, it's education management organizations, and they're developing their own bureaucracies. I mean, they're running 20 schools, 50 schools, 99 schools. And so the question is, do we want to end up in a system where we've got a new set of bureaucracies, and it would be a set, because in any state there might be several of these big organizations. So that's another reason for keeping the charters on the fringe of the system and to avoid that aspect. And then this last one is avoiding the resegregation of North Carolina schools. I was interested in the poll results that you just presented, that some people don't think that's very important. Some of us in this state and in Raleigh think this issue is extremely important, and I'm one of those people. So I don't want to set up a system that has some schools for blacks and some schools for whites, or some for high-income kids and some for low-income kids. And I worry if we open up the floods to charter schools, that's what we're going to end up with. And once you open that up, it's hard to pull it back. So I hope we can hold on to the good things we've got now and move cautiously to maintain some of the positive benefits of charter schools without allowing for some of the undesirable effects that pay insufficient attention to the public interest in education. Thanks.